Every now and then I get some really odd questions to answer. This one is, how long will a turbo last? I'm going to give you several examples of different time frames that turbos have lasted so you can get an idea of why turbos actually go bad. So a good example is one guy that brought a turbo to me. He told me the story of the first time the turbo needed to be replaced. That was at 500,000 miles on a 2011 Dodge 3500. The reason that one had to be rebuilt at 500,000 miles was because the engine went bad, and shortly after that the turbo went bad. The reason those two go hand in hand is usually if the engine has an issue where debris starts to flake off the rod bearings or a main bearing, it goes directly, well, it goes everywhere in the motor, but it will also go inside the turbo and cause it to have issues that could lock up, but usually it just causes it to get really gritty in there and loosens up the bearings really bad. So there was this one guy, and I've had a lot of examples like this. This one guy that I rebuilt the turbo for, he had an Evo 9, and the problem with this car was he sandblasted the valve cover and he didn't clean out the baffles in the valve cover, which caused the sand to eventually fall out of the valve cover and end up into the engine oil, which just circulates throughout the engine and acts like sandpaper on the journal bearings, which causes it to have shaft play, and eventually it starts to have some thrust wear from the sand getting inside of the thrust bearing and wearing that out as well. That's a case that seems to be really common with people who have rebuilt motors or they work on their own stuff that aren't as careful as they need to be when they do a rebuild or when they start putting different parts on their car. I have tons of examples. I had just like this one. I had another guy that had a Toyota Subaru, and eventually his wife made him sell it. But when I got the turbo, it had an issue with some debris going through the turbo as well. In that case, I think what happened with that one was that he installed a secondhand oil cooler that came off a car that had a blown engine, but there was debris all in the oil cooler, which went through the turbo and just caused a whole bunch of problems for that guy. So you can just see how much damage that can do to your turbo and your car. In that case, like he was telling me, he said his wife made him sell that car. That car will probably never run right until the engine is completely torn apart, everything flushed out, and that oil cooler either thoroughly cleaned or thrown away. A lot of times you just have to throw parts like that away. One of the first turbos I built, probably 2 or 3 years after I started, I built an H1C that I did a hybrid for. So I did an HX40 compressor wheel on that, and the guy ended up putting it on a DSM. So it's got a gas motor. He's running about 20 psi. Well, what I didn't know about those turbos is they have a really weak thrust bearing system. The thrust bearing is a web design, so it's not a full 360 degree. And also the collar isn't as wide as the HX model. That one ended up having a thrust bearing failure in probably 20 miles. I learned from that, and I came out with an upgrade thrust bearing kit for that one as a result of that. Another case is a Subaru turbo that failed. I've had several cases with this, and the reason why the Subaru turbos fail is because there's three screens inside the cylinder head, and these usually get clogged up, causing low oil pressure to the turbo. The turbo will go bad in less than 20 miles. The guy told me he had only a couple hours on the car and the new turbo went bad. So that's very common for the Subarus. So I had a reputable turbo company ask me why these BMW M4 turbo upgrades that he built failed so quickly, and I asked him to tell me what all did you do to that and what rebuild kit did you use. He told me how I used the steel thrust bearing. The problem with the steel thrust bearings is that they do not dissipate heat like the copper bar bearings do, which causes the problem. If the steel bearings were so good, they would probably be used a lot more in factory applications. Because the diesels do run a little colder, it's less likely to go bad on a diesel with having a steel bearing, but it's very common for them to go bad on a gas motor because they can run a lot hotter. A BMW N54 one that went bad really quick. I mentioned this in another video. This guy just installed the turbos, but he put silicone on the oil feed O-ring, and the silicone went down into the oil feed, clogged up the thrust bearing, caused an immediate thrust bearing failure. So in that case, the turbo went bad in the same day that they were installed. So he basically did like 6 hours worth of work of installing them. Turbo went bad, he had to send them back. I ended up just refunding him on that because that was about the second time he messed up the install, and I just didn't want to deal with this anymore. So I just wanted to get out of that situation because it was just costing me more and more money under doing the warranty job on that, even though I really shouldn't have covered that one anyway. That's all for this video. If you're interested in having me go into detail on each model, more examples on each model, I can also make more videos on that. If you want me to go in depth on one of those, you can always comment below and I'll make a video on that topic.